It's coming up on a month since schools reopened in British Columbia. If you're a parent, did you send your children back into the classroom? And if you did, why? And if you didn't, why not? Was your decision based on watching and reading the news? Were you influenced by social media or other parents? Was your decision about your children's education based on anecdotal evidence, or was it based on facts? Did you dig into the numbers? Dr. Chana Davis has a PhD in genetics and a deep background in biomedical sciences, and she is the mother of 3 elementary-aged children. Dr. Davis struggled, like all parents, with the same question about sending her children back to school. She turned to the Harvard Global Health Institute for some guidance to help measure the risk. The Institute says that less than 10 new cases per day per 100,000 people is a signal to be cautious, but it's not high risk. Then she looked at the local risk in her community. Davis said, "Show me the data." And in Vancouver, that data said that between August 21st and September 3rd, there were 307 cases, which when you divide that into 14 days, equals 22 cases per day. But then you have to divide that number into the population of the city to figure out what it means. And it means that there were 3 new daily cases per 100,000 people. And that puts Vancouver at the bottom end of the yellow or cautious zone. Davis crunched her way through the numbers and determined there's about a 4% chance of being exposed to COVID-19. She went on to say, "I don't think I'm crazy to send my kids back to school in a pandemic, at least at my local slice of it. We live in a yellow zone. Opening schools with ample precautions to her made sense." I invited Dr. Chana Davis, host of the video podcast Get Real Health, and the author of Fueled by Science, to join me for a conversation that matters about how she decided it was okay to send her children back to school.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the following and viewers like you. Please become a patron at conversationsthatmatter.tv.
Dr. Chana Davis, welcome.
Thank you.
You're here in 2 capacities. One is your sort of professional ability to look at information, health information, and make sense of it. Mm-hmm. And you're also here as a mother who had to make that difficult decision of sending your children to school this fall. Mm. What was the process that you went through? Just in case somebody doesn't watch all the way through. First of all, did you send them to school? And then let's talk about the process that you went through to make that decision.
Yes. I did decide to send them to school. And actually, I went through my main decision-making process was one I made in June. And so I had actually really taken a numerical approach to trying to quantify the risk that I was assuming, because that's how I roll. And so I sort of updated, I had the spreadsheet, and I basically updated all the numbers with what we had learned, both how the situation had changed here in BC, as well as what we've learned about COVID since June.
You were able to make a rational decision in a very highly emotionally charged environment.
Well, the rational part is just one piece of it, of course. And I think when I wrote about my decision back in June, I said, back in June, the risk was actually probably much lower than it is now. We were looking at case counts in the single digits per day around the time we did that. And yet there were a lot of people who would feel very nervous about sending their kids back to school. And I made a point in my conclusions of saying, your anxiety level is part of the equation. So even if your rational brain tells you it's okay, if you're not going to be okay with that emotionally, you need to factor that into your decision.
Okay. But how do you do that and make a rational decision? Because you are in essence saying, okay, I'm going to put your health, potentially mine, my parents' health at risk, because if you go to school, you get this, you bring it home, we share it, and we transmit it somewhere else. It's not just going into school. So then you have to say, well, what is the risk factor at that school. And so how do you then start to make that kind of determination? Because when I look at the information, I go, I have no idea whether or not there's a risk in this block versus that one.
Yes. You don't know. I mean, the best you can do is just drill into the public health data as locally as you can. And so just as the way I wouldn't try to conclude about my school from Canadian data, I can't really extrapolate either just from BC data. So I was actually grateful that the BC CDC was able to provide more regional data. So when I did my analysis, I looked at the Vancouver data. I definitely don't assume that all of Vancouver has the same risk. But I think when you're just essentially doing a modeling exercise, you just have to sort of consider worst case and best case assumptions. Let's say that most likely we're average, but we may be above that or we may be below that. So I think considering different scenarios and considering the worst case scenario is one of the ways that I like to approach it.
Okay, so what were some of the I guess, data entry points that you needed to have to be able to start to work your way through this calculation?
Yeah. Well, I was grateful that there have been some global, framework, sort of independent analyses on what's a reasonable risk level for communities to reopen schools. And so I found benchmarks provided by the Harvard Global Health Institute, and they said that, again, you can use different metrics, but the metric that they said to sort of look at as a starting point was number of new cases per 100,000 people per day. And so
within a confined area.
So exactly. Yeah. Of course you want that to be ideally that would just be in your tiny neighborhood, but if the most you can zoom in is the next level up, then that's what you have to work with. So I looked at that framework, and that framework said that under 1 you were in the green, between 1 and 10 you were in yellow. And yellow, and we landed at about 3. So we were on the lower end of the yellow zone, which to me told me, proceed with caution. Is my school proceeding with caution? Yes, they are.
So what information did you need from the school as well to help you determine whether or not, if you're in that yellow zone, that this still is going to be a wise decision to put your children back in that classroom?
Yeah, that to me it's well, on the one hand, it still is a question mark because I'm not even allowed in the school. I don't really know exactly how many kids are in my kids' classes and what the exact distancing between desks is. I can't see it. So I in part, am going on faith that the schools are required to meet certain expectations. And I know, although in many districts, the language is rather soft. It's as distant as possible, right? And with my... So my older son is in grade 4, and my twins are in kindergarten. So it was clearly stated that social distancing or physical distancing will not be possible at all times in this classroom.
I can't imagine how it could be possible most of the time.
Yeah. But again, this is where worst case scenario, understanding some of the science on worst case scenarios comes in, because I was able to look at what are transmission rates. So again, understanding what's the likelihood that someone comes to school is just the first part of the equation. The likelihood of transmission, that's where the school's practices come into play. But let's just say the schools do nothing and their practices are horrible. Then what sort of transmission rates would you expect? And you can look at epidemiological data to get a sense of how much transmission do we see within households, for example. And again, every one of those studies has many caveats, but all of the studies that I've looked at transmission rates within households, those are still in the 10%-ish or even less range. So if you have that as a worst case scenario, saying even within households, it's far from guaranteed that other household members will get COVID.
Even though you're living in an intimate setting.
Yes. So I think it's true that so in BC, we're seeing about a third of transmissions happening within households, about a third in long-term care facilities, another third in social gatherings and, basically young people getting together at parties and bars you would all expect. So many of our transmissions do happen within households, but not every household transmission opportunity happens. So it's very easy to just believe that everyone in the household will get it if some person has it, but that's not true. Again, even a worst case scenario assumption shouldn't be 100% of the time that your kid is exposed, they will get it.
And so even if they do get it, then what?
Then the chances that they pass it on to you have to sort of factor that in. It's certainly not 100%. Again, I'm not saying it's rare, but it's not as common as you expect. It's certainly not guaranteed.
So is it guaranteed also that, let's say you're diagnosed with COVID, that it's going to manifest itself in illness? And I ask this because I think of Novak Djokovic. Both he and his wife were infected when he conducted a tennis tournament. They canceled the tournament. He went home, self-isolated. No symptoms.
Very hard to get a handle on what fraction of cases are asymptomatic because, of course, many of those cases are not going to show up. But as we ramp up our contact tracing, here in BC, we have very good contact tracing. And it's actually very reassuring to know that the latest data that I saw, about 80% of cases were part of known clusters. And so when you do this extensive contact tracing, you will detect the asymptomatic cases. Anyways, I was looking at the data this morning on children, and again, the numbers that I saw ranged anywhere between 10 and 40% of kids have no symptoms. Again, it all depends on context. So one study was in hospitalized children, was 40% of them had no symptoms. They were hospitalized for other reasons.
But they were COVID positive.
Yes, exactly. So there was a study, it was a study in France where they looked at a couple hundred, I think, hospitalized children for random reasons. And it turns out, some decent fraction of them had COVID that they weren't picked up by symptoms. So certainly we know that symptom screening doesn't pick up everyone. But a good chunk of kids will at least show mild enough symptoms that if people are truly staying home with symptoms, you're going to take a bunch of those people out of the pool. Yeah.
And so contact tracing will tell us who those people might be and where there might be a potential risk?
Yes and no.
Because
contact tracing actually helps to take take active cases out of the circulation pool so they're not truly exposing the community.
So as a parent, though, do you have to be watching this whole time? You made the decision to send them to school, but that's on this day, this week, this month. 4 weeks later, the situation may be changing, and so are you having to constantly monitor this? And is that something that you would counsel somebody else to do, to remain vigilant?
Yeah. Yes and no. I would say I do monitor it just because I'm a bit compulsive in that way. Exactly.
That's why.
But I was also reassuring to know, again, so we are in the yellow zone at 3. Once you go deeply to analyze the implications of your starting point, you can then have everything else relative to that. So if we started at 3 roughly new cases per 100,000 per day, when you churn on that number a bit, it works out to be about 1 in 2,000 people that you think would be carrying COVID. Again, there's a bunch of reasons why that number might actually be an overestimate or an underestimate. But if you have that starting point, you can say, okay, well, now we're seeing double as many cases as we did when I did my deep dive. So is it up to 1 in 1,000 people? You don't have to do the whole analysis every time because you can just say, where are you relative to it? But at least in BC, knowing that we had, I concluded we have a pretty large buffer before we have to sound the alarm bells. And I think I've had other moms ask me, so at what point do you think, some parents have been frustrated, there's been no articulation under what conditions might we change our mind and send everyone home, right? The reality is that BC is doing worse than we were in June, but much better than many other places in the world. And so from our perspective, we're doing poorly because we're doing worse than we were previously. But we actually still appropriately belong in this yellow proceed with caution zone, and still can even double and maybe even more before that starts to not make sense.
Okay, so we're doing okay, you say, compared to other jurisdictions in Canada and maybe globally. What have you looked at that confirms that for you? Like, where have you looked? What have you seen there?
Yeah, no, BC was a bit later than some other places to open school, so you can learn a lot from seeing from other people's experiences. And the first the first area that we got a lot of insight from was in Berlin. My brother happens to live there, so I have an extra interest in seeing what's happening in Berlin. And it's really interesting how the news coverage sort of, in many ways, misrepresented what happened. So if you just Google Berlin schools COVID, you'll see about 20 different hits that all say 41 schools closed in just the first few weeks of reopening. That doesn't sound very good, right? Okay, but what's missing is the context. There's two critical pieces missing. One, 800 schools open. So 41 out of 800 is very different than 41 out of 45, right? But the second piece is they closed because as a precautionary measure, because a case was detected from the outside community. None of those cases, as far as I know, actually were from school-to-school transmissions. So it's actually a really good news story. 800 schools opened, 40 of them closed for precautionary reasons. As far as I know, 0 cases were actually spread in schools. So what did we actually learn from that? That transmission rates, we had 40 cases pop up, we had no transmissions. That's actually a very positive story, but most of the reception to that story is, did you hear what happened in Berlin? 40 schools closed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you see that all the time.
Well, welcome to the business of the news. You know,
Yeah.
the
I'm
whole
a naive
thing
outsider.
is you take a small piece of information and you stretch it out
Yeah.
and you go, there it is.
But, yeah.
But you're not necessarily giving context.
Yeah.
And, you know, you stay in the news business because
Yeah.
there's an awful lot of value in scaring people.
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly
Yeah.
what's happening. And I was thinking this morning I need to start an anti-news channel because it's the stuff that no one's going to click on because it tells you actually nothing horrible is happening. It's actually going well.
That's right. Nobody wants to click on that.
No.
And even though that's your message right now, you're
Yeah.
actually saying we're doing better
Yeah.
than you may think
Yeah,
we are.
yeah.
So in that, because people, you know, so you go through that whole analytical
Yeah.
process, but we come back to the emotional side of
Yeah.
it. And this is what drives so many people in their decision making. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't look after that emotional side appropriately, you're creating other challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, I found it very rewarding that my very analytical approach to trying to put a number on risk, I've had a lot of my friends tell me that made me feel better. So I think a lot of people are not really in a position to change their decision, but there are a lot of people walking around feeling stress and guilt for choosing to send their children back to school. And I think if I can help someone feel like it was actually a reasonable thing to do, and it is a reasonable risk to take for some people. For others, again, I think when we talk about the risk equation, this is just one input and sort of the back to school decision. This is one input, like trying to get a sense of the actual risk you're assuming, which includes both exposure risk and transmission risk, right? So, but the other piece of it is how bad would it be for you to get it? And if
Right.
you live with an immunocompromised family member, it's a very different impact.
Yes.
If you are that rare case where, you know, 1 in a million or whatever it is.
You know, you could be a type 1
Case.
diabetic.
Yeah.
You could have
Certainly.
someone who is going through chemotherapy.
Yes.
There's a whole host of
Exactly.
reasons why.
So the downsides
Yeah.
will be very individual. And in my case, my kids are all healthy. My grandmother visits. Their grandmother visits, but she's in good health. And again, then the upsides are also different. For some, when we talked about this on our block a lot in June, some kids were enjoying being at home, you know, and learning in that way. And other people like myself were tearing their hair out and, you know, it was not really working that well.
Okay, so does the answer come down to, yes, go do all this research, but you still have to decide for yourself where your comfort level is, whether or not the risk that's present in your school or your neighborhood makes it worth it.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and then
Yeah.
what are the impacts on your mental health either way?
Definitely.
Whether you send your kids back or they stay at home.
The thing the part where I hope to help others is that understanding what is the risk you are taking. Because it's hard, again, all you hear is this many new cases a day, this many new deaths a day, but I don't think the public health numbers are really being presented in a way that gives people a concrete sense of risk. So again, with the sort of math I went through in my article was, okay, so if you just take the numbers at face value, it's about 1 in 2,000 people affected. Again, if you drill into the public health data, you can understand why that's probably not the right number. And in fact, children have, that's an average. So children tend to have disproportionately fewer cases of COVID. So maybe it's actually only 1 in 4,000 kids or something. So, but if you have just some number in your head, you know, again, understanding that there's a lot of uncertainty around that number, then you can start to say, okay, well, if it's 1 in 4,000, my school has 400 kids, what's the chances that someone's going to show up to school? There's a 1 in 10 chance or something that someone's going to show up in school. How many, if my kid's exposed to 40 kids, it's 1 in 100 chance they're exposed. What's the chances that there's a transmission? People assume the transmission is 100, but it's not. It's actually far less than 100.
Okay, what's the most important source of information from you? Because if you're getting it only from the news, you get distorted figures. You get 49 new cases today. Well, where?
Yeah.
How? Like, it's not detailed enough information for me
Yeah.
to be able to say, okay, this is going to affect my decision about whether or not I'm going to send my child to school. So where do you go to get that information?
Most public health agencies do have a dashboard you can tap into, and I spend a lot of time on our dashboard. But I think it's really important. Probably the most valuable thing you can do is put the numbers in context of per 100,000, or just population correct your numbers. Because again, you're going to see big numbers when you're looking at what happened in all of Ontario with 15 million people, or I don't know how many kids are going back to school, but to always contextualize the numbers by population.
Right. And this is important because it gives you a sense of what is the likelihood of being in a cluster where there's the likelihood of spreading is going to increase. And so right now, you're still comfortable sending your children to school.
Yeah, and I am. And as other parts of Canada put out their dashboards and we see what's happening in Ontario and Alberta, yes, there are cases, but if you sort of do a back of the envelope calculation, how many cases might you expect if the population frequency is what it is on the dashboards? The cases are actually, again, if you consider how many kids are going back, well, we sent, 10 cases sounds scary, but if you're sending 50,000 kids back to school, it's actually a small number. So I would say that the resources to go to, number one, look at your public health dashboard and try and get the sense of numbers per 100,000. Look at the numbers in children, because most dashboards do provide a breakdown, and you'll see that they're less common. Of course, you'll be missing cases too, but you'll be missing cases elsewhere. And the second thing is, many school districts are putting out exposures, but I would actually discourage people from obsessing too much about those because, the policy is, you'll be notified on a need-to-know basis. And I think that given the success of our contact tracing, at least here in BC, if you have good contact tracing, I'm not going to be actually combing that exposure list every day.
Well, thanks for coming in and sharing that with us, because it's the kind of insight that a lot of people can benefit from. Thank you very much.